Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. On this episode, I'm talking to a behavioural science practitioner who's got an interesting idea for how we can go about solving problems. Now, his theory is something that feels inherently wrong, because what he's proposing is that if we want to solve problems effectively, what we shouldn't do is come up with new ideas. Rather, we should borrow from old ones. And that seems somewhat counterintuitive. After all, when we're faced with new challenges, it often feels like we need unprecedented solutions. But my guest, Sam Tatam, thinks that far from looking for revolutionary ideas, we should instead be looking for evolutionary ones. Sam is the global head of behavioural science at Ogilvy. That's the practice set up by behavioural science legend Rory Sutherland. He's been on the show several times before, and you'll find links to his appearances in the show notes. And in Sam's brand new book, Evolutionary Ideas, he shows how behavioural science and evolutionary psychology can help us solve tomorrow's challenges, not by divining something the world has never seen, but by borrowing from yesterday's solutions, often in the most unexpected ways. What you're about to hear is Sam explaining how processes that are often used in the physical world, where, for example, architects and designers borrow from Mother Nature's inventions, can also be used in the cognitive world to solve other problems. It's a really interesting idea that can help us find innovative solutions to the problems we're facing, which of course can help us to reduce human risk. So please enjoy, as I know you will, my discussion with Sam Tatam on evolutionary ideas. Sam, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Thanks so much for having me on. It's wonderful to speak.
I'm really excited to have you, and we're speaking about as far apart as we can get in the world because you're in Australia and I'm in the UK. But one thing combines us is a love of behavioural science. But for my listeners that haven't come across you before, can you tell them a little bit about yourself?
Of course, thank you. So my name's Sam Tatam. I'm the global head of behavioural science at Ogilvy. So Ogilvy has a big behavioural science unit, which is sort of really headquartered in the UK, where you are, Christian, where I've spent a lot of time. And we really exist to bring the sort of the world of behavioural science and creativity together to solve some of the world's stickiest challenges. And it's a really fortunate role, I think, to be able to sort of explore different categories and industries and styles of problems to see how we can sort of bring these two worlds together.
Amazing. And you are, well, probably by the time this is out, we'll have just published a brand new book on evolutionary ideas. So to start us, what does that mean? What's that about?
So evolutionary ideas is all about borrowing from what's already adapted around us. We have as sort of humans, certainly in the creative industry and in marketing, I think we've got a lot of challenges with assuming that we need to be revolutionary every time we're faced with a challenge. We assume big problems need big solutions or novel challenges need new solutions. But actually evolutionary ideas is really an exercise in better exploring the ideas that have evolved around us and how we can sort of redeploy them to solve the challenges that we face today and tomorrow.
And so you're really taking, I'll try and summarize it and then tell me where I've got it wrong, but you're basically saying, well, look, there's a lot we can learn from human evolution and Mother Nature about how to solve problems. And you beautifully tell this by, you just pick lots and lots of examples of things that have been, discovered that nature has already worked out. And therefore, rather than us literally reinventing the wheel, it's like, why don't we take inspiration from that? Is that a fair way to describe it?
That's exactly it. And the inspiration for the book, actually, someone shared a video a little sort of about 5 years ago, actually, on biomimicry. And biomimicry is a sort of a fascinating field that really exists to borrow from biological evolution to solve distinctively human problems. So the assumption is that anything in nature that's around us today has survived sort of 3.8 billion years of research and development. There's got to be something good about it for it to survive. So rather than feeling like we need to sort of create new technology or solve something from sort of conjuring up magic in a dark garage somewhere, we can actually look to nature and deploy it. So fascinating fields like wind turbines are now being designed based on humpback whale fins. So the tubercles of the humpback whale have sort of perfectly evolved to maximize lift and reduce drag. So instead of sort of trying to think of new ways in which we can do this in wind turbines, let's just whack a humpback whale fin on a propeller and see how we go. And it's a lovely analogy for I found it to be a really powerful analogy for the work that we do, not in sort of applied biology, but in applied psychology. And just as there are evolved biological solutions, what we have found is that there are lots of evolved psychological solutions, and we're able to access this more easily now because of the field of behavioural science that sort of really work to codify these concepts. Once we have this language, we can start to see them. Just as physics has helped us with gravity and lift and drag and these concepts now that we can help us to navigate the complexities of the physical world, now we have a language to help us to best navigate the psychological.
And I love that because, as you say, I mean, your start point in the book is looking at things. So there's a lovely story you tell about the Shinkansen train in Japan, which is the bullet train, which is probably worth getting you just to retell that quickly because it had more biological input than I had ever imagined. I mean, I knew some of it, but not all of it. And so you start with that, and we'll get you to tell that in a second. And then we move into, well, we can do it in the physical world, but we can also do it in the psychological world. But can you just give us that Shinkansen piece as an example?
That's right. And the Shinkansen is a wonderful example of biomimicry in action. So essentially, the Shinkansen 500 series is sort of the bullet train in Japan. And the challenge that they faced in reducing the time that it took passengers to travel between, I think, Tokyo and Osaka wasn't necessarily a speed challenge. It was a noise challenge. So actually, the faster the trains went, the more noise that the trains were making that was sort of going beyond the regulation in Japan. And there are a couple of things that were causing the noise. The first element was a part of the train called the pantograph. So the pantograph connects the train to the overhead sort of wires. And as the trains were sort of racing along at blistering speeds, they were making these sort of turbulences of air, and these turbulences were making a lot of noise. So the head of engineering for the project, a gentleman called Ijai Netkatsu, he was a wonderful engineer, but also an avid bird watcher. So actually, rather than thinking that he needed to sort of find some new concept within physics, he actually thought, well, what can we learn from birds to help us address some of these challenges with noise? And for the pantograph, actually, there are two birds that the team were inspired by. The first being the owl. So the owl's an amazing sort of nocturnal predator. It's evolved over millennia to sort of swoop down and stun its prey in virtual silence. And it's able to do this because the feathers actually have micro serrations, so little sort of serrations on the feathers that chop up these sort of larger vortexes into micro vortexes. So they actually sort of just dissipate the air. So by chopping up the turbulence, they're able to sort of be whisper quiet. So similarly, they created micro serrations on the pantograph, and they were able to reduce this noise somewhat. The second inspiration for the pantograph was the Adelie penguin. So the Adelie sort of often see it sort of shooting around the Atlantic, and one of the elements of the Adelie that helps it to be so agile and smooth in the water is what's called a spindle shape. So it's sort of almost a diamond shape, sort of for the pelican. Did I say pelican? Penguin. And essentially, what they did is again shape the pantograph based on the Adelie, and they're able to reduce this sound even further. So by borrowing from the owl and the Adelie, they were able to sort of address the pantograph. But the last challenge, and I'll sort of wrap up because I can feel myself going along on this story. But along the Shinkansen rail, there is a series of tunnels. So in evolutionary sort of classic theory, we might call this an environmental constraint that we needed to address. And as the trains went through the tunnels, they were creating tunnel booms. So it's a bit like firing a bullet from a pistol, creating sort of a loud bang. And again, going over the regulation in Japan. So to address the tunnel booms, the final inspiration was the kingfisher. So a bird that sort of evolved to plunge from the air into water to skewer its prey. They actually ended up firing a series of bullets into air tunnels, just to sort of see the perfect shape of the noise of the train to address this tunnel boom, and it ended up being sort of virtually the same as the shape of the kingfisher. So they redesigned the nose of the train based on the kingfisher to address the tunnel boom. So it's just a lovely example of actually there's a sort of a series of challenges that we're facing to address an objective of going faster, and rather than start from scratch or looking to conjure sort of lightning, they actually just borrowed from the infinite wisdom of evolution around us in biology.
And what I loved about it was, and this is the neat link into your broader theme in the book around the psychological space. But I mean, that takes tremendous courage for somebody to sit there and say, hey, I know how we can solve this, right? And to pull something that probably wouldn't pass muster in a normal kind of meeting, because so advertising, it makes you can, in a creative space you can think of stuff, but in an engineering space, that's quite brave to do that, particularly when you're going, well, I do this thing as a hobby and it's given me an idea, fine to make an ad. You really wouldn't expect that in the physical engineering space.
No, and I think, and there's a big challenge, I think, in addressing borrowing solutions, and there's an ego challenge that we need to address in assuming that we're sort of not creating something or being the mastermind of this new solution, but actually just sort of adapting from what's around us. So I certainly think there's a role to play in how we present solutions and how we justify solutions. That to even if it means just making them feel new or novel or more effective than before, even if we know that it's actually just sort of redeploying something that exists around us. I think absolutely that's a challenge to face. And I think part of, for me, and I hope this comes through the book, is that this doesn't mean there's no role for creativity and novelty in how we deploy these concepts. I write in the book around sort of these are sort of around the idea. I think Bill Bernbach sort of talks about the idea as being the soul of the solution. It's not necessarily the final execution, right? So we can sort of better understand what idea can we borrow, and that can be executed with creativity and flair and in a way that's right for a brand, for example, if we're speaking of marketing. But the fundamental concept has likely been solved before. So let's sort of savor some of our energy and reduce the time that it takes to innovate, so we can maybe spend more time on the execution than in the origination of the idea.
So you start with the physical world, and then how do we then get from the physical world, where that example that you give is very clear? What's the flow then into the psychological?
So there's three sort of layers that we explore in evolutionary ideas, and the first tool, I suppose, is the field of biomimicry. So an assumption that there's wisdom in biology that we can redeploy to solve human problems. The second tool is actually an engineering framework called TRIZ. So it's a Russian framework that has essentially identified that there are existing patterns of engineering solutions around us that we can redeploy systematically. So TRIZ has found sort of 40 inventive principles that we can use to solve engineering challenges. So one principle is nested doll, the concept of nested doll. If you think of a classic Russian nested doll, that's sort of the archetype of a suite of solutions, like a retractable sort of camera lens or a nail bottle of nail polish that has the brush inside the bottle. Those are both examples of nested doll. And what TRIZ, this engineering model, gives us is not only an assumption that, okay, we can sort of borrow, there are patterns of solutions in biology and there are patterns of solutions in technology, but it also brings to bear a concept of solving contradictions. So a big element of the TRIZ methodology is that innovation is the resolution of a contradiction. So to explain that a little bit further, if we were looking to innovate a Kevlar jacket or a bulletproof jacket, the question might be, how can we increase the sort of the strength of a Kevlar jacket to stop a bullet without making it so heavy that people can't wear it? So to actually solve that challenge to stop a bullet while making it wearable, that requires innovation. How do we make an umbrella big enough to cover the human body, but small enough to fit in a handbag? That requires innovation. And to help manage these sort of contradictions in TRIZ, they've developed a matrix. So you look at these different sort of variables, whether that's weight or speed or length or volume, to see how we might, increase the volume without increasing the size or increasing the weight, for example. And if that's a challenge that you face in engineering, then it helps us to identify these inventive principles to solve it. So actually, you should consider nested doll, for example, to solve that problem. So that's a stepping off point then for solving psychological contradictions. So we have a suite of behavioral science, and evolutionary psychology is giving us a suite of psychological principles that we can learn from. Like the concept like social norming is a sort of a psychological principle. The concept of scarcity is a psychological principle. But we're able to now sort of apply this on purpose to solve psychological contradictions. Not how do we increase the strength without increasing the weight, but how do we reinforce trust without changing the truth? How do we help to aid decision-making without limiting choices? How do we trigger action without forcing a response? How do we help someone to be more loyal without sort of needing to boost incentives and commercial outcomes? How do we change experiences without altering their duration? So we can then start to sort of navigate what we do in the book, sort of 5 key central contradictions, and how these inventive principles that are around us can solve that.
What was fascinating for me was you started with the biomimicry piece, and then you moved from which sort of takes you into the space of engineering, and then you take an engineering model that moves into. So I thought the flow was really interesting because you were sort of riffing from one to the other, and it was kind of, if you looked at the initial leap, it feels like, well, what the hell does like the physical? How do those two things? But it's that link in the middle that I think is really powerful.
Yeah, I think it helps us it helps to join the dots. So the assumption is that there are evolved solutions that can benefit us. Just look at the Shinkansen. And actually, we can do this systematically. Because you might think of the Shinkansen 500 story, and if it wasn't for Ijai Nakatsu being an avid bird watcher, that might never have happened, right? Those two worlds may never have met. It was joined by an individual, not a process. Whereas TRIZ is a process. It's a methodology around sort of systematic innovation. And what I've sort of passionate about and really hopefully have brought through in the book is that there can be a systematic approach to applying this for innovation when we're looking at concepts and psychological solutions. And just as importantly, it doesn't mean there's no space for creativity. It just means we can accelerate sort of asking better questions earlier. And that's the pointy end of the spear for me. How do we action this? And that's one of the challenges that we often face. I've faced for many years. Sort of applying behavioral science in creative and commercial scenarios is this theory is great. These illusions are fun. How do we do it? And the simplest way that I've found over time is just asking better questions. There's that lovely sort of saying: don't ask someone to say ouch, just prick them with a pin. Don't sit a creative team down and talk about the ins and outs of prospect theory. Just ask them the question: how might we make it look like their friend has bought that just before them, or they might miss out if they don't act now? Those are questions that we can all answer, but arranging these questions and tailoring these questions to a specific outcome, like reinforcing trust or aiding decision-making, is what's so valuable. And here, it's the nuanced examples of evolved psychological solutions that are around us that can help us to ask richer questions. So to say that another way, the innovation of the Shinkansen wasn't just let's learn from birds. It was actually there's an evolved difference between the owl and other birds. It's actually the unique characteristics of a microserration of its feather that we need to borrow from. Just as it's not just whack on a beak, you end up with a toucan, and you got to blow the tunnel away. But it's the specific evolved difference of the kingfisher. So if we know that there are concepts like social norming that have been sort of proven in many different contexts, and there's a big story around replicability and culture and context and individual differences, and I touch on this, and it's really important. But actually, if we can identify that social norming or creating a norm is a viable evolved solution, there are many different hundreds of examples of these nuanced examples that are slightly different to the other. And if you can look at these and find these examples and be sort of more like bird watchers as we go around sort of our practice, you can find these evolved differences in social norming solutions that give us richer questions to ask of our challenge.
And what I absolutely loved was that you veer between telling stories from nature and telling stories from history to kind of what I'll describe as sort of Sam's photo diary. And so there's lots of pictures in there, which I think are delightful, of things that might surprise people. So there's a picture of a boarding pass and a picture of a half-eaten bar of chocolate and various other things that you use to make examples. And I'm fascinated how you went about picking those, because obviously, as you say, all of this is very rich. But how did you go about thinking about fusing that personal and the bigger picture piece and picking the examples that you used?
It's a good question, and it becomes a bit of an affliction after a while. You can't stop seeing these things. I mean, you can't go on holiday without stop the car. I've just seen a sign that you need to. You know what I mean?
Because it's bad enough for normal behavioural scientists, right? Just wandering around the supermarket, but you've just added nature into the mix.
I talk about it in the conclusion. Like once we have a framework to help us to navigate, then we see these solutions everywhere. So the book is for me, it's the foundations of a framework. It's a philosophy of how we can go about problem solving. And it's by no means an exhaustive review on the psychological principles that are relevant to some of the core concepts that the book explores. So when I looked at sort of structuring the book, I wanted to have a balance between sort of really robust areas of psychology, but also the fun and the flippant that arrogantly or not, hopefully not so. I thought if someone had an excuse to talk about horse balls in an academic book, then hopefully that's me. and to, as you say, to learn from a chocolate bar and to bring that into a world or a half-eaten pizza, and to sort of connect that dot with something that's kind of hardcore academia, but you wouldn't be able to connect those dots if you didn't know. So when I looked to sort of structure the book, it was this sort of a balance of what gives a great flavour of the breadth of how this approach can solve challenges. What are the really sort of the big rocks of theory that need to be addressed, and what are the lovely examples that give you a bit of a smile in the mind that lighten it, because we can't bore people into adopting this stuff. I mean, if you can,
well, it would be ironic, right? Because I always find it fascinating when you get people that you're working behavioural science but can't sell it, because it's sort of you're showing precisely the challenge that you're purporting to be able to solve.
Yes, yeah, completely. And often we find when selling in solutions, it's sort of helpful to start with academic theory but then move to the anecdotal, but connect the sort of the lines so people go, well, I've seen that, I've experienced that. You look at the diversification heuristic, that we sort of tend to diversify our options over time, and if we're sort of faced with more immediate decision making, we tend to sort of continue with the same choices. And you can look at academic theory, you can look at sort of studies done in universities where they ask students different time periods what snacks they might buy, and you can sort of say, tick, we've got the sort of the peer-reviewed stamp, and people can nod but not feel it, not own it. But then if you just say, I bet sort of every time you go on holiday you pack 3 pairs of jeans that you never wear and you fill up your Spotify with songs that you never listen to, then you can start to say, well, actually, this isn't just about a university sort of study. This is happening to me every day, and I can see it's relevant across many different industries, including my own. And that's the piece that's I think important for this, for me, really important for this work, that actually we tend to be guided by the category or industry that we're in. And for many years as a strategist within sort of a more classic advertising role, we'd look at sort of creative reviews for clients, and we'd look at our competitive set, and we'd say, okay, I did a lot of work for Castrol Motor Oil years ago, and you'd say, okay, what are Valvoline doing? What's Penrite doing? What's your and you look at your competitive set, but we'd never stop to think of doing a creative review of Powerade or Gatorade. I mean, like, why would you do that? But if you sort of understand that they're both sort of, from a psychological level, sort of the same product, you're asking someone to pay a premium for a product that they can't see is working, and just strike the belief that it's worth the money that it is to charge. So if you can say, well, how does Powerade encourage you to invest in electrolytes? So we can sort of see how we can encourage someone to invest in Magnatech. And that's the bridge that we need to cross. So that actually BMW can borrow from a bank, just as a charity can look from JP Morgan. And if you can connect those dots with psychology, then the world of inspiration's opened up. Now you're not looking at category or industry, you're looking at a solution to a psychological problem. And so this question sort of stemmed from the examples, and I think so the diversity of examples are really important. That it's from sort of commercial adaptation or product design. Others are just things that we see around us. I mean, like dropping cigarettes in a pile that quickly become a norm. These things that we don't think about, they're not commercial, but we still borrow from them.
And the bit I thought was wonderful about was actually it helps you to spot those things, because otherwise you could sit there and say, well, there must be a parallel with X, and we'd be blinded by our own biases, assuming that no matter how sort of wild and wacky we were trying to be, actually chances are we wouldn't take ourselves to all the potential places. And of course, we can't look at everything. So we need some sort of guide. And that's really what you're doing here, isn't it? Is just sort of saying, actually, yes, of course, be massively open-minded, but we need something to drive that inspiration. And that's the science bit that we can look at. And therefore, it's almost like we're better informed when we're snooping around and being creative.
and not limiting ourselves to our category or industry, but honing in on the problem that we're looking to solve. So if what we need to do is aid decision making to reduce complexity, or this isn't a a problem that's unique to your industry or your brand. I mean, people have been facing this challenge for eons. So sometimes we might look at channel. We might go, how are people doing it on a website? And even that feels like it's already a step too far, right? Because you can think of concepts in the world around us that can be applied to a website. So it's really about hopefully removing some of the things that might limit our thinking and redirect it to what's the psychological problem that we're solving? What are some of the most relevant psychological principles that can help us to address this? And what are some evolved examples of these principles that we can adapt? And they might be in sort of, again, who would have thought that a kingfisher would inspire a speed train? They might be in a place that you least expect it. But if you can remove that limitation, that bias, then there's actually a far richer and fresher sort of pool of inspiration. And again, that's where creativity comes from, when two things that otherwise wouldn't have met come together. And it's really about bringing these existing solutions to spaces they otherwise wouldn't be.
This has clearly been a long time coming. This isn't sort of something that suddenly occurred to you. This is based on your experience and thinking for quite some period of time, right? So this has been a labour of love for many years. All the links that you've made, has that always been obvious, or were you sort of pulling back and thinking about it? How did you go about building that overall framework?
So the big catalyst for me for the book was stumbling across biomimicry. So that was the penny drop. Okay, we do the same thing just psychologically. I've learned a lot writing this book. I mean, that's been the gift, I think, of committing to write something, is that there's a lot of research, a lot of learning that goes around it. I think, and to help to translate this. I mean, there's complexity in here, right? Like we're talking about a couple of different layers of approach, but hopefully the effort is worth the reward once you get there. But I think there's some simple structure in learning from marrying principles with challenges. So navigating the world via psychological principles and using examples as creative inspiration. That's something we've been doing sort of for a long time. But using the existing disciplines of biomimicry and TRIZ as stepping stones to something that can be less haphazard and potentially sort of biased, even in sort of matching principles. You can start to have a more systematic approach. So that's been those have been sort of two key steps in the big concept of the book. And then it's just about structure. So how can we make it simple enough to sort of unearth each of these schools of thought, and then make it practical. So the big thing for me, and it's probably a part of that I speak sort of least about, is actually the five key contradictions that we explore. I mean, they take up a majority of the book, that really going deep into trust and some of the psychology around that, and to, again, spaces that you wouldn't expect that you can borrow from. Looking at decision making, looking at sort of last mile triggering action, looking at loyalty and experience and the perception of time. Really fascinating sub areas of exploration. So I think sort of having a strong setup of the philosophy, a bit of an exploration as to how we apply this and why language is so important to help us navigate the world, and why questions are so important to help us to liberate creative solutions. And then the five contradictions as to these are likely challenges that you face every day. Here's a kickstart to address that.
Permeating throughout it, and this fits entirely with your personality, right? But there's a real sense of fun, which is I think, the stories you tell sort of bring a wry smile, or and there's and as you say, there's sort of ridiculous things and extreme things and stuff that sort of doesn't belong thematically. You wouldn't expect to find in the book, and I think that really comes through, and that's clearly a key. I think that's a key part in terms of selling the discipline and the ideas, right? Which is that ultimately you're engaging human beings.
I'm really pleased to hear you say that, because I think it is important. You can't bore people into adopting this stuff. And I think there's also been a lot written on behavioural science, right? There's the theory has largely been covered in many. And this, I write at the very beginning, like this book is an adaptation in itself, right? Borrowing from different worlds and bringing it together in a sort of a different whole. But I do take great pleasure in matching the unexpected. Speaking with a laundry detergent to say, actually, we need to think more like a cocktail maker, and actually about creating a new sort of washing program to reduce the wear and tear on your clothes. It's quite complex. You just need to call it something that's a bit more like a Long Island iced tea, like arguably the most complex here. It's got like everything you can think of in the planet, but you just call it a Long Island iced tea. It makes it accessible and easy. So by bringing sort of worlds that you wouldn't meet, it's fun. It becomes a bit of a creative intellectual game, but I also think it just makes ideas more accessible, and it hopefully demystifies what oftentimes people think is hardcore academic concepts and sort of all the mystical dark arts. And you say, well, actually, if we consider it just as a pattern recognition process, that studies are just finding patterns of human responses. I mean, this is how we tend to respond in these scenarios. It's just a pattern of behavior. Once you label that pattern of behavior, then you're able to extract it and use it. And it's really just about what these labels can help us to do. Doesn't mean that it works every time. I write in the book around a lot around language. And the analogy that I use is around sort of the concept of banana. Every morning we don't sort of say, let's wake up and have that sort of yellow, bent, slippery morning state. You say, let's have a banana. And it just makes it efficient. It just makes it efficient to have banana. But it has lots of existing associations with that concept. And if behavior change or innovation was a bit like making a fruit salad, it's more efficient for us to say, well, shall we try the banana than shall we include the long bent slippery morning? So it just helps us to more efficiently sort of get to, and again, it doesn't mean it's going to work every time. And as I write at the very end, like extinction is a part of evolution. Things failed, but we understand under what context it's failed. We have a hypothesis that we can test, and we can move on from that. But in a world that sort of approaches innovation a lot like rolling the dice, we can actually be more systematic in this, and we can start to include or discount solutions with a scientific method rather than put something out there and see if it floats. And the best thing about that is if it does float, then we know how to extend it. It's because again, we're not talking about the execution. I go back to that Bernbach quote. It's about the soul. It's about things that can live on in other forms for the same brand or the same challenge. And once we know something is working, then so how do we get the most out of this? How can we extend that concept or execute it slightly differently in different touch points? That's what becomes exciting.
And I thought there's a really interesting sort of theme of courage in a way throughout, which is sort of this idea of courage to try different things. And so the support to that is what you've just outlined, right? Which is the reason you can go push the envelope here is because we've got the science to back it up in terms of the behavioural science, but we've also got things we can lean on. Mother Nature's been doing, as you say, the R&D and the hard lifting for us. And I thought it was nice and refreshing because it was sort of for people. There's going to be people that won't touch it at all, the unadventurous types. But for anybody that's sort of slightly minded to be adventurous and think differently, and I think that's clearly something we need to solve the problems we've got. I quite like the fire it could put under people because suddenly you've got something you can anchor it to. And say, actually, this isn't just me making nonsense up. Look, here's a basis on which we're doing things. And so if it does fail, it's not unintelligent failing, it's trial and error. And therefore actually go out and try some things. And there's a lovely sort of childish playfulness to it, which is kids have no fear. And I found there's a little bit of me reading that, just thinking, there's a bit of what you're talking about there that really seems to be to just grab that and just try things out. But you've got a basis for doing it. You're not experimenting in a way a kid, which is just to see what happens. We've got something that we can anchor it to, which gives us that defensibility.
That's it. And it helps us to, and Rory Sutherland, many of your listeners will know, is the founder of our practice at Ogilvy, has a lovely term for this. It sort of expands our solution set. And so it helps to open up the world of potential solutions. But by doing this also, you can justify why I might have done this. So we can look at, okay, this is the logic that we've followed. And an engineer can do this because it's easier to sort of think of XXX. And at the end of the day, we're going to put it through a wind tunnel and that'll give us the data to progress. The same thing is true of us, but actually instead of having a wind tunnel or a chamber to fire different bullets shaped like different beaks of birds, we put it in a natural context and see if it's got friction or not. But we can justify why we've included a kingfisher shape because actually this sucker's diving into the water every day, and it's working. So it gives us, exactly as you've said, it gives us a justification for exploring something we might not otherwise. And I think in using language of adaptation and borrowing can also remove some of the fear, because it's thinking differently in the sense of we're able to sort of go beyond where we might have otherwise outside of our category or industry. But it's not like crazy off the wall thinking. It's thinking differently by applying things that are already there. It's not sort of, trust me, I'll come back in a week. You know what I mean?
Yeah, totally. And I love that there's a bit where you talk
Yes.
about checklists and the importance and I love that because your position on checklist was exactly the same as mine used to be, which is like, oh God, I hate these things, right? It's about as inhumane as it gets. And yet you rightly point out that and so I thought that was an interesting microcosm of your whole approach, right? Which is you're positioning someone as saying you're not somebody that wants to just slavishly follow things. And yet you've built some so there's an irony sort of that we're trying to structure creativity and intelligent thinking, but there's always another one of those sort of tensions there between those two things. And I like the fact that you had disclosed yourself as not being a checklist lover to start with, because I thought that gave a lot more strength.
So, and again, when you talk about checklists and creativity, they see sort of diametrically opposed concepts. But in reality, and there's a lot that's been written on this and some great studies around sort of the underlying structure of creativity, from Agatha Christie and Shakespeare to sort of some of the best most effective adverts who follow a formula, even if we might not know it from the outset. Just like Triz, there are patterns of solutions that exist. And the checklist really helps us to be exhaustive in our approach. Sometimes if we're looking at checklists in surgery, it's about sort of avoiding catastrophe. It's about leaving that one swab in. That's the thing you want to avoid. But for us, it's about sort of leaving one stone unturned in where the solution might be. And I've found checklists to be really effective as we've educated people into behavioural. So I found it sort of effective for myself as I've learned to moderate workshops and creative sessions. I don't sort of pull out the notepad and go through the checklist. Over time, you begin to internalize these, so you're able just to extract a sort of a belief. And I write in the book sort of the role of a good psychologist isn't to rock up with the solutions. It's to come up with the right questions to help the expert to come up with the solution themselves. And in a world where, and you're sort of similar faced with this in your practice, that you're sort of going in very different contexts with different expertise all the time, whether it's health and safety, whether it's organizational policy, whether it's looking at website design. I mean, there are people with expertise far greater than our own in the specific category. But if you can ask them different questions, you can take them to spaces that they wouldn't otherwise. So checklists just help us to sort of, and checklists based on questions, help us to sort of make sure, are we exhausting the potential avenues for a solution here? And sometimes when we sort of use similar approaches, I often have a picture of Ronan Keating on the wall or up on the screen. So, because you go through,
as you would, obviously, right?
Because you go through many different questions, and I always say it's okay if you say nothing at all. Some
musical reference that will be lost on many people, but I'll put a link to it in the show notes for those that are too young, right?
But it's because not every question has a gold solution, but it doesn't matter because we just need one. Again, it's rather than sort of the one swab that's left in the surgery. It's the one idea that's going to change the game. And sometimes it can be a bit of a volume game initially, but I'm a firm believer that this approach takes us to ideas that we would never come up with otherwise, even just working by yourself. I've had times where I was like, I have to come up with some solutions here, and I go back to a list of questions that I myself wrote. I mean, I'm counselling myself here, but you're just forcing your brain into a structured approach in tapping on the door. So I'm a believer in question thinking and how questions can sort of take us to spaces that we wouldn't have otherwise, and that checklists play a key role in this. And the natural organization of behavioral science based on these sort of inventive psychological principles help us structure these checklists. So if we think of the concept of social norm, how might we make it look like someone's attended just before us? What can we leave in the environment to show that someone's been there safely? What can we take away from the environment to show that someone's conducted a particular behavior before? I mean, three very different questions, all related to the concept of social norm, that I suspect will give us very different answers. And we can go and go and go. And again, this is where sort of these adapted solutions around us help us to ask richer questions, because we'll see some nuanced example in a cafe somewhere. Oh, that's a slightly different approach to that. How might we help someone sort of advocate in advance for us? Or how might we arm someone with the ability of leaving a testimonial? I mean, it can go and go and go. And I do give an example of the sorts of innovation questions that I think are helpful and liberated by concepts in the book. And at the end, there's sort of a suite of checklists that look through these 5 concepts, these contradictions of reinforcing trust, aiding decision-making, triggering action, boosting loyalty, improving experiences. So there's a start there. Again, it's not an exhaustive list by any means, but it helps us to see how a simple question, well directed, can help us hone in on some of these concepts.
And I've got to admit, I was very pleased you did that, because as I was reading through it, I was like, oh, that's interesting. And then I thought, I wish there'd been some kind of workbook. And then I got to the end and you'd done exactly what I was looking for, which was this sort of just helpful in one place. Because almost, I think as one goes through the book, your mind is racing around things. And particularly where you've done there's a lot of stories you tell where you go, where the hell is this going? Which is entirely the intention. And then it suddenly hits you. You go, oh, okay, right. I now see the punchline. And then I'm focusing on that, and I missed it. So it was lovely actually to have it all wrapped up at the end in a kind of user-friendly piece. So for anybody thinking this just sounds like it's a flight of fancy, and it is, it's right, all those things, it takes you to amazing places. But when you get to the end, there's a thing you can actually take and use.
I'm pleased to hear that that's how it felt. Sort of your sort of user experience of the book, because that's part of the intent is to start at a sort of a mile high. You're in. And I mean, how does talking about a vampire bat going to help us with this? You're in, and slowly sort of whittle ourselves down to and fundamentally, as I said, the point end of this pier is, what question does this help us to ask that we might not have asked before? So I'm pleased that was your experience, again, sort of connecting a couple of foreign worlds through a single concept, but making it useful. I mean, the intent of this is to inspire us to feel that there is a role for applied behavioral science in innovation. There's a critical role of applied behavioral science in innovation, and it's and there's a lot more to. I mean, this book can only take us so far. I mean, there's obviously lots more we can do, but there are ways in which we can think about this really simply, and it's a one-line question.
And actually, so my next question for you is where do you go from here? Because obviously this is you're on a journey in discovery, and I know that writing a book is not a sort of thing it's not like a blog article you just bash out, right? This is a labour of love that's taken some time, and you probably want a little bit of a breather after having done it and doing loads of these sorts of chats. But as you look ahead, have you got a vision for where you go now with the philosophy? Is there a part 2? Are you just enjoying the ride away and we'll see where we go? How's that?
I think the question, I've sort of not gone there yet, but I think there are ways in which we can start to hone in on specific category challenges, which sounds odd because I'm sort of trying to be category agnostic. But when we look at it at the moment, we're looking at sort of, again, trust, decision making, action, loyalty. But if you look at patient experience, for example, what are some of the key challenges that patients might feel or practitioners might experience communicating advice or diagnoses, or what are ways in which we can actually be more focused on a specific challenge of telling bad news, or motivating someone to continue for a course of treatment, for example. So you can start to think, well, again, this is a specific challenge in the health industry, but you've also got a product recall for Apple that you can borrow from in helping a practitioner communicate bad news to a patient, so that we can start to sort of be more nuanced in the nature of the contradiction. As I said, we've sort of looked at what might be considered sort of a big five. If we were to be inspired by TRIZ, I think there are sort of 39 different parameters that they explore in the matrix. So there are many more nuanced psychological challenges. That would be a next step. But I think a potential also is to more formally build this model, this matrix, this framework, without being so limiting. Once you put things in boxes, it sort of feels finite and closed. That's the concern there. But I have to say, I mean, it's as you say, it's been a lot of work over many years, and it's a story that I've been wanting to tell for some time, and I'm pleased that it's out and we can start to see this philosophy, and hopefully, as I said, it just encourages more people to look at this as a viable innovation ingredient. It's not a silver bullet, but it's a critical component, and it's not as inaccessible as we might think. And this is just the top of the iceberg as to what I've seen and what I know we can do with this theory.
How do we stop ourselves copying bad ideas? Because I mean, you talk for example about the Apple thing, right? So there's an example of people, they generally get it right. I mean, they screw some things up, but they generally get it right in terms of communications. But it would be equally possible for us to potentially stumble across someone that, I don't know, maybe we found that we could concoct a good argument based on nature as to why this might seem sensible, but it's not a good idea at all. How do we make sure that we're copying well?
Yeah, I mean, good question. I think it's, again, if it's driven by the theory. I mean, so it's the copying comes from knowing there's a concept here that we want to explore, and it's about occupied time. You know, so that the fact that sort of time feels faster when we're occupied than unoccupied. So if we're navigating via this principle, we might find a bad execution, you know, that we inadvertently borrow from more heavily, or we might just find it doesn't work because it doesn't work, and the context is wrong. It's a very different cultural dynamic that norms or ego drivers or individuality or collective identity is more important. So there's many different factors that can help it to sort of to see if a solution works or not. So what I'm not suggesting, so we will copy things that don't work. We will deploy an idea well intended from one context to the other, but we need to, just as we can fire different shapes of beaks in an air tunnel to see which one has the least resistance, we need to pressure test it. We need to put it in the environment, the context that it needs to survive, and see if it does or doesn't. And that's not, sometimes that can be sort of a get out of jail free card, or just test it, you know what I mean? But there is a degree of that, but it's knowing why we're testing something, what we anticipate to happen, and if it doesn't, we can exit it from the breeding program, and we can we can focus on the others, and we'll have an idea as to what might be driving the success of the others, and then how we might deploy that differently in the next layer. So I think, in answer to your question, I think if we start from we still need to start from academic theory, right? This isn't just, that's an interesting thing that I've seen in nature. Let's whack it in there. But the theory provides the guardrails, the navigation tool to help us to sort of connect these dots. And we'll find that we're not successful every time. As I said, it's a lens, not a silver bullet. But it can be a real liberator for efficient, effective innovation if we can begin to deploy it more regularly, more systematically. As I think we certainly can.
The alternative to what I was proposing, right, which is I don't want to back something that might be wrong, is if you don't think about alternative, you don't experiment, you could go all in on something that's terrible.
Yes.
And so this whole philosophy of, and I find it fascinating when we look at sort of the idea of winners and losers in a polarized world, is that actually what you're presenting here is a neat illustration why we need as a species to start thinking in terms of trying stuff out, experimenting, seeing what works and what doesn't. And that often is not permitted in certain contexts. And so a lot of what you're talking about here is just to say, look, let's just Mother Nature experiments all the time. We can think in those terms, and we should be thinking in those terms. And actually this degree of certainty that I think is prevalent in a lot of business thinking and political thinking in a particularly polarized world isn't helping that at all. So this is a nice counterweight to some of those trends of going, we don't always have the answer right, but as long as we place enough bets, we'll be okay.
Yeah, I think there's a degree of that. But one is the bets that we're placing has depth behind them. I taught in the introduction a concept. I forget the term actually. Gary Pisano wrote a great Harvard article around innovation, and again, it's sort of where this idea of rolling the dice. It's like let's just put out lots. It's called the shots on goal fallacy. That's what it is. So the more shots we have, the more we'll score. So we sort of and there's a degree of that, but I think it's not about sort of just having more shots on goal. It's about having potentially fewer variants, but variants that are inspired by robust concepts that we can see in other categories or contexts that are effective, that we can bring to our specific challenge and put it through the ringer. And again, it's the same as an engineering challenge. Ijana Katsu and the team didn't just sort of change the pantograph and go, we're done. It requires tests to perfect it, but that wouldn't have made that leap. We wouldn't have sort of had that step change of creating micro serrations on the pantograph if it wasn't for the owl. It's not to say they got it right first time, but it helped to get closer to what the winning answer might be. So I hope it's because the risk is, and I feel this sometimes in behavioural science, it can become a real sort of get out of jail free card. You sort of, we'll just test it. And I think it has to have that. But we need to justify why we're testing, not just because it's sort of good science, but if a test is effective, how does it work in the next iteration? And if we don't understand the central concept behind its effectiveness, then we're floating from execution to execution.
Yeah, well, it struck me it's a bit like sort of being drunk in a casino, right? If you're just sort of randomly placing bets on tables, you might get lucky. Yes. But will he be able to explain the next morning where the money?
Well, there's Jason Hill is a gentleman I used to work with a lot in Sydney, and he's now the head of strategy for Ogilvy in Singapore. Had a lovely sort of way of saying this. Like sometimes certainly in advertising and marketing, we have sort of lots of happy accidents, and he had a sort of a lovely phrase saying, "Now we have fewer happy accidents and more planned ones." And I think that's a lovely way of saying sort of more planned accidents. Again, it's not the silver bullet, but it helps us get closer to a more sort of systematic approach to getting lucky and finding, again, if we think of it more like a breeding program, we're building from what works. Sometimes you can overbreed, but it's about getting the balance right.
Well, so just thinking your philosophy, I mean, is there any time where you would sort of go, actually, we should, in this particular instance, right, this doesn't work, or is this generally applicable across the piece? I mean, it seems to me it is, but I thought it's just worth sort of challenging.
No, it's a really good question. I think, and there are often times, I mean, certainly if I think of our work within Ogilvy and when we're engaged and most effective in our role, there are certainly challenges where I look and I think, well, there's actually we're not adding this school of thought, this discipline isn't adding as much to this specific challenge or brief as others, and we don't, as the behavioral science practice, we're not the authority on creativity or effectiveness, right? Our partners within Ogilvy have been coming up with amazing behavior change solutions for decades. So there are certainly examples, and more so when you look at the realm of the perceptual, like that there are other ways of coming at the solution. We can always, it can be applicable. It's just, is it meaningfully different enough to deploy a different tool? Maybe not. But I've never is a strong word. But I find it hard to think of briefs or challenges that we couldn't add incremental value by applying this style of thinking. It's just picking the ones where we think, actually, this is going to be a real unlocker here. And I can't think of examples off the bat, but I think in our world it might be more sort of awareness, perception challenges, that big, bold, creative thinking, a culturally relevant solution that's just of its time, delivered brilliantly, will do the job. There are others that are more nuanced and complex, that are really sort of fundamentally sort of psychological gristle, that this approach can help sort of tease that out, sort of massage these knots, to see what can break it down. Yeah.
And I think it's interesting, actually, because I was sort of reflecting on it, and I thought, well, for me, the answer is I think it's always worth having a look at, right? And you could draw the conclusion and say, actually, doing that, it's not going to make a massive difference. So based on what we've seen, so let's not pursue that, because actually the political cost or the hassle or whatever is not worth it for that thing. So I always sort of think it's a lens that I can look at things through and say, let's give this a crack, and we don't pursue it if it's not going to work out. And if for whatever psychological or practical reason it's not worth pursuing, but at least we've started and we've got an angle on it. And sometimes I think it's sort of this action bias of sort of, actually sometimes it's best let's just not do anything, right? Let's not bother with a huge, if we're not going to have a big impact.
Yeah. And again, it can be just asking slightly different questions than we would have otherwise. And so it doesn't always need to be sometimes it can just be framing the problem slightly differently. That can, and you can, 15 minutes, you can chew it around with a partner or a colleague and say, actually, there's something here, or you know what, all roads are kind of leading to where you would anyway. So let us complicate things, or muddy the waters with extra heads in the room. Just go fire win. But as I said, there are briefs and there are challenges where you look at them and lick your lips and know that there is a space that we'll explore because of naturally where we go that wouldn't be a typical creative response or a typical approach to thinking about this. And those are the briefs, those are the challenges that get us really excited. Coming from working within sort of the traditional agency, I've always been passionate about developing ideas that we wouldn't have come up with through other means. And oftentimes you come up with a solution. That's a great solution, but I can imagine the PR team would have naturally gravitated towards there, or the advertising. And again, it's not just to detract of any of our expertise. It's like, what is additive? What are the ideas that you wouldn't get if you didn't approach it this way? And that's always what sort of I'm passionate about. And I think as a practice in Ogilvy, it's about these ideas that we wouldn't have come up with through other means that can be the unlockers.
Before I let you go and we remind people about the book, give you a quick opportunity to just do an advance plug for Nudgestock, which is your flagship event. And you did and I'll put a link to this in the show notes. You did a preview of your thinking around where you were at with the book last year. And that was well worth watching, gave us a clue as to what was to come. But for those people that haven't seen Nudgestock, just give them a sense of what they can expect without revealing anything.
Yeah,
obviously, that's not
well, thank you. And Nudgestock, I mean, we're immensely proud of Nudgestock. So it's our 10th year this year for Nudgestock. So we sort of started as a 450 person event in the seaside in the UK, and now we've sort of moved to a digital global platform. So Nudgestock is really a celebration of behavioural science and creativity, and bringing the sort of the world's either sort of best known or lesser known speakers of some of these sort of concepts together to create a bit of a sort of an extravaganza or sort of a bit of a meal of insight. So last year we had John Cleese, Daniel Kahneman, Dan Ariely. I mean, just having Daniel Kahneman and John Cleese in the same platform is
just insane, right?
Is magical. And it's I often find that Nudgestock, the design isn't that you like every speaker, but that someone takes something out of everything, and hopefully you walk away with a way of thinking about your business or your problem that you wouldn't have otherwise. So this year in our 10th, we're similarly going global, going digital. We've got some great speakers lined up already, which will be revealed in time, and we're going deeper into some sort of more sort of category specific areas. So really sort of honing in around sustainability and health and some sort of core practice areas that we think are really important. But yeah, I think I have to confirm, I think it's the 11th of June this year for our 10th. But I'll confirm just the final dates before we sort of post that on the wall. Yeah, event.
And I've got to say, last year, what was amazing was it went from being a physical event, and you effectively turned it into a TV show. And it was a pretty little studio, and so there were some lovely moments of things not quite working out the way they were planned, and you guys styled through them beautifully. And so I think it's lovely to see this isn't just we'll do what we've always done, and stick a webcam at the back of the room. This has become a proper TV production, yes. And it shows in the production values and just the way it's structured. So I just want to say all power to you, and on behalf of those of us that get to enjoy it and don't have to do anything, but just literally sit on our sofas and enjoy the best part of it, and it's more. I think it's more than 12 hours, a heck of a long time. So thank you on behalf of all of us putting on a fantastic show, and I've no doubt this year's is going to be even better than this before, because every year you seem to make it a little bit better. So high bar to reach, but I'm sure you'll
Thank you. No, it's a pleasure. And we so always say it's a team of psychologists putting on a TV show now once a year, and a few other sort of big steps this year in thinking about how we drive engagement and explore sort of other digital opportunities for bridging these physical and online worlds together. So again, will be revealed in time, but we're an ambitious unit. We like to sort of step it up as we can. So really pleased to hear that it's well received, and for us, most importantly, it's bringing people to our category that we love dearly, that we're big believers in, to solve some of the world's sort of stickiest and most important challenges.
Amazing. Before I let you go, remind people what the book is called.
Thanks so much. So it's called Evolutionary Ideas, and it's launching on the 10th of May. So it's been wonderful to sort of talk through it, and I hope sort of in some moments too much detail, but gives us a good read as to what we're exploring, and it's an area that I'm extremely passionate in, and it's a book that I'm really proud of. So lovely to hear that it sort of you enjoyed the experience, and I really hope your listeners do too.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you.
So that's it for this episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Sam for appearing, and to you for listening. To find out more about Evolutionary Ideas, to see the video from last year's Nudgestock that saw Sam present some of the ideas from the book, to hear the episodes of the show featuring Rory Sutherland, and lots of other relevant links, have a look in the show notes. You'll find those there. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. If you like the show and have yet to leave a 5-star review for it, please do so. It really does help. You can just do that on whichever platform you're listening to the show on. To find out more about human risk, the work that I do with my clients, and to subscribe to the Human Risk newsletter and watch Human Risk video blogs, have a look at human-risk.com. I'll be back very soon with another episode of this show, but in the meantime, stay safe, remember to explore evolutionary as well as revolutionary ideas, and thanks for listening.